We have Felicity Crowe and Nicole Sheldrick here from Vilnius to talk to us tonight. That is the British Institute for Libyan and North African Studies. And they're going to talk about the archive that we are very privileged to have right here at University of Leicester. Unfortunately, Professor Mattingly is not with us tonight. An important note for us in the room, if anyone is going to the pub afterwards, we're changing location to Old Horse, but I'll remind everyone at the end. We will take questions at the end, and for anyone online, please write your questions into the chat and we'll read them out to the speakers. So it's up to you, ladies, whenever you're ready.
Hello, I'm the archivist of Vilnius. I've worked with the archive since May last year, and it's been a real pleasure getting to know the archive and the people who feature in it. I hope to share some of that pleasure with you tonight, hopefully. I should mention, though, that I'm not an archaeologist, so David, Ahmed, Nicole and Mohammed have all very kindly helped me with some of the archaeological aspects of my part of this talk. I'm going to talk a little about the history of the archive and its contents, what I've been doing and how we're preparing the archive for the future. So, this is the catalogue. The archive is the memory of Vilnius. It houses the corporate papers of the organisation, records generated by projects funded by Vilnius, and the papers of many scholars associated with it. It was established in 1988 with the donation of the David Smith and Owen Brogan papers, and it has continued to grow ever since, with now about 60 collections. This is a screenshot of the online catalogue, which you can find via the Library and Archive page of the Vilnius website. There are some enormous collections, like the James Copland Thorne papers, which is 48 boxes of material, and you can see it at the bottom. And other collections like this one, which is as small as a single notebook. This is the entirety of Vilnius's Allen Waste collection. Many of the collections relate to deceased scholars, such as James Thorne and Richard Goodchild. Others, like Philip Kenrick and David Mattingly, have donated papers in their own lifetime. The archive moved to the University of Leicester in 2012 to follow a cluster of scholars with a research interest in Northern Africa. You can find it, and normally me, on the 18th floor of the Attenborough Tower on campus. This is some of the specially built shelving, and there are also chests for large maps and plans. So today, the bulk of the collection has been catalogued by a series of temporary archivists, of which I'm the most recent. Cataloguing a collection is very important. It means an archive can understand what material it has and allows researchers to find that material. In recent years, Vilnius has focused more on the archive due to the difficulty of undertaking fieldwork in Libya since like 2011. And so by the standards of the archive sector, it's very well catalogued we're in a good position. So a researcher who visited the archive recently said that it's full of treasure, and it's true. Most of the collection is records generated by British archaeological expeditions to Libya and Northern Africa. This is a small selection from the Ward Perkins and Barry Jones papers to show a few of the different types of records you might find in the archive. The records in the collection often cover planning for expeditions, so that can be funding applications for projects and correspondence, field records generated during expeditions, so that could be field survey notebooks, find records and photographs of excavations, and also records generated after the expedition, which could be processing data, finds illustration and catalogues, project reports, drafts for publication, and lots more correspondence. So women archaeologists are well represented in the archive. We have here Owen Brogan making a squeeze at Gerza, and Kathleen Kenyon in a trench at Sabratha, up here. And the archive covers many important sites and excavations. Some records belong to expeditions that are as yet unpublished or underpublished, so have great research potential. By examining the records, researchers can also find new interpretations and ways to use the data, since many tools for analysis weren't available when the expeditions were originally carried out. Archive records are also useful because the process of excavation is, of course, destructive. So the archive and any publications may be the only record of the stratigraphy of the site, and sometimes not only the stratigraphy, but the entire site can be lost. So this here is a plan from the unpublished web papers, which are the only existing record of the ancient field systems of Cyrene, which have now been destroyed by urban and agricultural development. So I'll run through a small sample of the collections in the archive, and then talk about the work I've been doing over the last 15 months. So firstly, the corporate papers. These chronicle the history of the Institute from when it was established in 1969 as the Libya Exploration Society, as it's described in its first set of rules, which you can see here, to today. The papers contain Dulnes's founding documents, as well as correspondence with the Department of Antiquities in Libya, the British Academy, the French and Italian archaeological missions, members of the Society, and scholars from many disciplines with an interest in Northern Africa, among many other items. The corporate papers show the real variety of Dulnes's interests and activities, and how those activities have changed over the years. They also give a good sense of the importance of archaeology in Libyan politics and international relations. So in some periods, when relations between the UK and Libya have been strained, archaeological expeditions were one of the few lines of communication between the two countries. The UNESCO Libyan Valleys project, for example, mostly took place in the years after the killing of Yvonne Fletcher, when diplomatic relations had ceased between the two countries. Overall, the corporate papers and the wider archive show a community of archaeologists, their rivalries, but more often their friendships and networks of collaboration and support. So one of the first sets of personal papers deposited in the archive was the Ulwyn Brogan papers. Brogan is one of the most important archaeologists of Roman Tripolitania, and is particularly associated with Gerza, but studied many other sites in Libya. Gerza, a Romano-Libyan settlement in the Tripolitanian pre-desert, had previously been superficially reported, but archaeologists have tended to focus on the more famous Roman cities on the coast, like Leptis Magna and Sabratha. And in the 50s, Brogan, with David Smith, was the first to seriously study the site. Brogan tended to concentrate on the mausolea, cisterns, and flood control walls of the settlement, while Smith focused on the settlement itself, its middens and cemeteries. The project involving survey and excavation remains a key publication on the cultural history of a Libyan rural farming community. Brogan was also a founder, member, secretary, and later vice president of the society. Then we have the David Smith papers. After Smith's work at Gerza, he later returned to Libya in the 60s, directing expeditions to the Cyrenaican coastal city of Tokra. Some of the Tokra material hasn't yet been published, and this material is particularly valuable because much of the southern area of Tokra has been bulldozed since his study. And you can see some of his drawings of lamps from Cyrenaica on the right. Then we have the Kathleen Kenyon and John Ward Perkins papers. Kenyon and Ward Perkins directed excavations at the Phoenician and Roman site of Sabratha, a major town on the coast of Tripolitania. The expedition studied a large area of the city: the Forum, Antonine Temple, Severn Monument, residential insulae, harbour, and Byzantine defensive wall, among other areas. And we're digitizing this collection at the moment, which I'll talk more about later. So these notebook pages are from the collection of research papers that led to the publication of Christian Monuments of Cyrenaica. Here you can see architectural details from the East Church at El Latrum. This project was particularly important because it's the first study of Cyrenaican rural sites from any era. Previously, archaeologists in Cyrenaica had concentrated on towns. By the 1970s, the Sidi Krabish cemetery in Benghazi was one of the only areas of the former Hellenistic and Roman city of Berenice that hadn't yet been developed. But the cemetery came under threat of development, and the society funded urgent rescue excavations. This project brought new insight into the dating of pottery in the Eastern Mediterranean. And you can see in this photograph the city pressing around the edges of the site. The UNESCO Libyan Valley Survey, or ULVS, ran in the 1970s and 80s, and was a collaboration with the Libyan government to try to understand how the Tripolitanian pre-desert could have supported such dense human occupation and agriculture in the Roman era, given its inhospitable environment, and whether the area might be able to do so again. The area is full of Romano-Libyan fortified farms or gaza, flood control walls, cisterns, tombs, and earlier flint scatters. This is a collection I catalogued earlier this year, so I know it quite well. And this is archaeologists excavating an olive press. And then lastly, the Fazan project was a flagship project of the Society in the 1990s. It used the mostly unpublished papers from previous fieldwork by Charles Daniels, which are also held at the Bilnes Archive, to plan the project, which included an excavation at Old Germa, a fieldwork walking and reconnaissance survey, a topographic survey of standing structures, and geomorphological and geographic studies. The Fazan project completely changed the understanding of the inhabitants of Fazan in the Roman and pre-Roman era, and how they adapted to their harsh environment. I'm just cataloguing this collection at the moment. I've been working through excavation notebooks and diaries, theodolite surveys, drawings, photographs, correspondence, and much more. And this is a lovely kite photograph of an antennae tomb, with the antennae or arms reaching towards the east. And there are lots of other collections which we don't really have time to cover this evening. So this is me. A little now about what I've been doing in the archive over the last 18 months or so. So I've catalogued new material, ingested legacy catalogues into the archive, added new information to existing catalogue entries, have been managing the digitisation of the Kenyon Ward Perkins collection, started running engagement projects with Libyans, and have created policies and plans to ensure that the archive is more sustainable in the future. And so firstly, legacy catalogues. Before I arrived at Bilnes, Ahmed Bouzayan created an enormous spreadsheet documenting the more than 5,000 maps, plans, and illustrations in the archive, including this elevation of the Severin Basilica with the tiny angry griffin, and a plan of Cyrene East Church. So one of my first tasks when I arrived was to add this information into the catalogue so it could be seen by researchers. To do this, I added a hierarchy, standardized the data, adjusted it to international archive standards, and then ingested it into the catalogue. And so now the little griffin and the thousands of other maps, plans, and illustrations can be searched online. I've also been cataloguing the backlog of uncatalogued deposits. This has included the ULBS project, Sidi Krabish excavations, Isabella Siostron collection of Lepkis Magna pottery drawings, many more maps and plans, additions to the corporate papers and other collections, and now the Fazan project. I'm not sure how familiar people here will sort of be with archival work, so I thought it might be useful to talk through some of the decisions an archivist makes when cataloguing an archive. So cataloguing is one of the real pleasures of being an archivist. Most archivists are quite nosy people, and cataloguing can feel a little like eavesdropping on conversations in the past. It's also extremely satisfying turning the disorder of an uncatalogued collection into order. So first of all, before getting stuck into cataloguing, I would research the context of the collection and have a quick skim read of some of the publications generated by the expedition. I check there weren't any conservation emergencies, such as active mold, damp, insects, and so on. And then I'd have a rummage through the collection and make a rough box list of what it contained. And the next step is appraisal. So deciding which records to keep and which to dispose of. There are some appraisal decisions which are very easy indeed. If you have 20 identical unsigned copies of a memorandum of understanding, you can probably get rid of 19 of them. But other decisions are harder. In order to decide which records are important enough to keep, you need to think about how you define important. Records with original archaeological data, or that show how that data has been processed and used. So, for example, these excavation notebooks from Sidi Krabish, or this printout of the ULBS finds database, I would, of course, keep. When there are records with traces of Libyan life and people, I would tend to keep these too, like this scrap of paper about a knowledgeable old man who helped the ULBS project. I might also be interested in keeping records with emotional power. So, for example, one of the last letters sent by an archaeologist before he died quite young. when cataloguing unpublished excavations, I would also tend to keep much more than published excavations. So once you know what you have and what you will keep, you can start to fit it all together into the series and subseries of an archive hierarchy. As an archivist, you try to preserve the original order of a collection. This helps researchers find material and to understand its context and meaning, something that's especially important with archival records, which often don't make sense if taken out of context. So, for example, these scraps of paper from notebooks in the broken papers. But trying to uncover that original order can feel a little like detective work. In the Vilnius archive, many of the collections have been passed between archaeologists who have used and arranged the papers for their own research, so it can feel a little like an excavation through several layers of occupation. One example of this is the Cezanne project, which reused and reordered the archive's Charles Daniel papers. To try to find the original order of the ULVS project, I looked for any obvious series, for instance, site record sheets arranged by Wadi. Then when I found partial series, so for instance, record sheets for sites AG 1 to 73, but 74 to 81 missing, I would look for the missing records to establish the complete series. While doing this, I would also look out for potential series. So for instance, if the correspondence is all stored together, though it's possibly out of chronological or recipient sequence. In order to try to find series, it can be helpful to know that different seasons of excavation often use different stationery. So with these notebooks from the Cezanne project, the blue notebooks on the left are from 2000, the red and black are from 2001. So now I've created the structure. I can also add the miscellaneous folder with the awkward records that don't quite fit anywhere else. I do quite like rummaging around miscellaneous folders in other archives to see what records didn't fit into their system. So once I have my hierarchy, I can start creating catalogue entries for each record. There are some required fields like the date and extent, but much of what I write in the catalogue entry can be very subjective. I must imagine future researchers and which elements of the record they might be interested in. If you take this page of the Sunday Ghibli, an English language newspaper based in Tripoli, you can see a picture that shows British soldiers re-erecting a column at the Temple of Zeus at Cyrene, which an archaeologist might find useful for understanding how Cyrene has changed in the 20th century. But in the same issue, there are also adverts for swimming costumes and articles on Libyan news from the perspective of the local English-speaking population. If I don't note down these other details, history researchers won't be able to find them, so I need to think carefully how to describe each record in the catalogue. Then finally, with the structure in place and each entry added to the catalogue, I would create the finding aid to help researchers understand and navigate the collection. So this is the finding aid for the David Smith collection, and then all done. So now that much of the collection has been catalogued, we're working to enhance it and make it easier to search. To help researchers search the collections, Vilnius has developed the online Heritage Gazetteer of Libya, a project led by Charlotte Ruchet, which will be an extremely useful tool. One great problem for researchers with an interest in Libya is the many, many variants of place names, which can make it hard to find all the archive material relating to a particular site. Some sites might have a Roman or Greek name, ancient names of Libyan origin, a modern Arabic name, and various transliterations into the Roman alphabet, which can change depending on the period the transliteration took place and the nationality of the transliterator. So, for example, what I would call Tokra with a C has many different names, as you can see here. And at the moment, in order to find all the archive records relating to Tokra, a researcher would need to search the catalogue for several of these variants. At the moment, I have some student interns working to link the gazetteer to the archive catalogue, so that using the gazetteer, which has a single page that links all the variant names for each location, a researcher will be able to find all the records relating to a site, to a place, no matter which variant names they use, which will be very useful indeed. I've also been collaborating with the archivists at the different British Research Institutes, or BIRI, on the BIRI Digital Archives project. which is a great chance for us to identify how we can enhance our online catalogues and use digitised records. And just a small part of this project, which is led by Constantina Georgiadou, Charlotte Rouchet, Nerden Chayarasmus, Amalia Kikissis, and Valeria Vitali. As part of this project, we're preparing to establish an online search portal that researchers will be able to use to search all of the Furry archives at once. But in order to do this, much work needs to be done. A first step we are working on is to establish a minimum set of requirements for the metadata we hold in our catalogues, so that there are some consistent elements, that there are some consistent elements that can be searched. We are also working to establish authority files so that researchers can find all the archive material that relates to a particular person. This is especially useful because archaeologists often work in many different countries, leaving a trail of records connected to them in several different Furry archives. For instance, the archaeologist Mervyn Popham worked at Knossos, so the British School of Athens have this letter to him on the left, discussing the excavations there. But he also took photos in Libya while he was a naval photographer in the Second World War. And this on the right is his photo of the theatre at Sabratha. The creation of authority records does, however, present a slight problem. Many images in the archive show local unnamed people, as well as named, often European archaeologists. And we want to avoid just making these named people better known and easier to research while neglecting the unidentified people, further reinforcing the original inequality. So every person who appears in photographs, almost every person, will receive an authority file, even if those files are something as basic as Illness Anonymous 1, Illness Anonymous 2, and so on. And then where an unidentified person appears in more than one image, like this man at the Sheldrick excavations, we can link the different photographs to the authority file, even without a name. I sort of given him little red arrows. And perhaps one day we might possibly be able to find, put a name to that face. So as another part of the Very Digital project, we're also organising a series of remote public engagement sessions. And Ahmed has has very kindly done lots of Arabic translation for me. Later, we will use this project to produce a guide for other Bury to developing public engagement events with people in the original country. As I said earlier, the Vilnius archive mainly comprises records generated by British archaeological expeditions in Libya, but we also have hundreds of photographs that show, sometimes accidentally or in passing, glimpses of 20th century Libyan culture and everyday life. This is one of my favourite examples. You can see the tomb very well, but there is a floating baby on the left, and the watching mother holding it is just a sliver of fabric. The archaeological content of these photographs is often well documented. We know, for instance, that this is tomb W100 from the necropolis at Cyrene, but we know nothing about that baby or its mother or what they were doing there. Even when they are completely in shot, the glimpses of Libyan life often go undescribed. There are images of people taking a break from reconnaissance surveys to play board games we're unfamiliar with, and men being used as human scales, wearing clothing we don't have the knowledge to describe correctly, and celebrations we haven't been able to identify. This means it's harder for researchers interested in Libyan culture to find the material they want, and once they found it, to know what they're looking at. So as a first step to remedying this, we plan to deliver a series of small-scale remote events in Arabic and English, each with a different theme. During session discussions, we will use digitised photographs from the archive to spark discussions with participants, and comments from attendees will later be added to the archive catalogue where appropriate. And some comments and stories will also be used in a sort of bilingual exhibition. We're not quite sure where it will be yet, in collaboration with the original contributors. During sessions, we'll also use these sessions. We'll also use these sessions to consult on how we can make the archive more accessible for people in Libya. The project will help us document records featuring modern Libyan culture better, and will raise the profile of the archive among people of Libyan origin in Libya and in the UK. So the first session has actually taken place now, and we're very pleased with how it went, aimed to find out what clothing can tell us about the people who wear them, or what Libyan clothing can tell us. So for instance, with these images, what do their clothes tell us about their social status, political outlook, age, and regional and tribal affiliations? What are the connotations of the different ways of draping the clothing, or of wearing traditional clothing, more westernized clothing, or a combination of the two? What names do these items of clothing have, and did those names change according to the region? Often they do. We also wanted to find out more about people's personal memories and family traditions around clothing. Do they have a particular item of clothing that has been passed down through the family? Do they remember their grandfather wearing a hat like this? And do they remember playing with it when they were younger? In the second session, we will use photographs showing non-archaeologists experiencing archaeological sites and built heritage being reused and repurposed. So, for example, Arabic graffiti on a Roman-era mausoleum and Roman-era material being reused in more recent buildings like this. I think it's very unlikely that anyone participating in the sessions will have graffitied the Roman mausolea at Giza or anything like that. But we will use these photographs to spark a more general discussion about how Libyan built heritage is used and reused today, and Libyans' experience of built heritage and the meanings it holds for them. Did, for example, they go on school trips to archaeological sites or hang out there as teenagers? Do they have a daily morning walk there, or take their children there? Or even do their relatives leave their rubbish there? How has the relationship with heritage changed through the generations in their family? And what has their experience been of archaeological sites, excavations taking place in their area? And did they feel informed about what was happening? We're also planning a session on photographs with people who may be Libyan archaeologists, but whom we haven't yet identified. Generally, photographs showing people at excavations are not labelled with their names, whether they are European or Libyan. We can often identify the European archaeologists more easily, but Libyan archaeologists can be a little trickier. We'll see if people can recognise them, and if we manage even just one, we'll be very pleased. So at the moment, we're digitising our first collection, the Kathleen Kenyon and John Ward Perkins excavations at Sabratha. This is a couple of pages from a notebook on the Antonine Temple. This is a really important first step to making our collections more accessible to researchers in Libya. We're just having a company digitise the material at the moment, and we will deposit the digitised material with the Archaeological Data Service, or ADS. And we chose the ADS because they have experience with archaeological archives, and they both digitally preserve the images and make them available online to researchers, which is quite unusual, and they're also quite cheap. So in preparation for deposit with the ADS, I have worked with Nicole to create a subject vocabulary for this and future Vilnius digitisation projects, which will make digitised images more easily searchable in future. So as a starting point, we selected relevant terms like pit, and this is a pit, from the vocabularies recommended by the ADS. These recommended vocabularies are created with British archaeology or European archaeology in mind. So we then added words specific to North Africa, which we took from the North African Heritage Archives Network, like Marabut, the burial site of a holy man. And then we added a few words of our own that hadn't already been covered, but would be particularly useful for the Vilnius archive, like opus africanum, which is a style of masonry. And so I don't have time to do everything I'd like to do myself. So we've recruited quite a few student interns who have worked in the archive while learning new skills. And this is one of my interns, Katrina, scanning some negatives from the ULVS survey. There have been quite a few different projects, intern projects. So one set of students each picked a Libyan monument and used photographs from the archive to see how it had changed through the 20th century, either through being damaged or restored. It was sometimes challenging to track changes, since photographs are often from different angles, but students still found some interesting alterations. Others used archive material to create mini biographies of the women archaeologists in the archive, and we added some information from these to the archive catalogue. And then others have looked through the archive for traces of the experience of Libyan archaeologists or workmen who collaborated with excavations. And one nice example of this is the Arabic vocabulary in one of the Sidi Krabish excavation notebooks. You might be able to see here, if you look carefully, ladder, bucket and rope, but also moustache, married, scorpion and cigarette. So my role is a temporary one. And I'm trying to set up systems in the archive so that it can function when there's no longer an archivist around. So firstly, I'm creating a cataloguing guide. Many of the archival rules for cataloguing are a little counterintuitive at first glance. There's a good reason for them, but they can be difficult to understand. So I've created a cataloguing guide for unsupervised volunteers to use. This will mean, hopefully, that volunteers create standardized data that is more consistent with the records already in the collection and those of other archives, and it's easier for the next archivist to ingest into the catalogue. The digitisation of the Sabratha collection is the first collection we are digitising, but we are planning to digitise many more, hopefully. To prepare for this, I'm writing a digitisation guide for the next archivist to use to make things a little smoother. Digitising the collection will really allow us to engage more people in the collection, both in Libya and in the UK. Yes, and Valeria, the Vilnius Honorary Collections Officer, is also a lecturer in digital humanities, and she's got some great ideas for getting students working with digitised material. I've also worked on creating a digital preservation strategy for the Vilnius archive, which it will be possible for students to volunteers to work through when I'm not here. Over the last few decades, our lives and our work have moved into the digital realm. We send emails and WhatsApp messages instead of letters, and create digital GIS files instead of notebooks full of theodolite measurements. But this digital material is more fragile than its predecessors, and there are concerns in the archive sector that there is an impending digital dark age, or a period with very little knowledge available to the researchers of the future due to a lack of effective digital preservation. Analog material is mostly much easier to preserve, so newspapers can be a bit of a headache because they're printed on cheap acidic wood pulp that disintegrates. But otherwise, if you have a letter or a side record sheet, as long as the environment is reasonably stable, without dramatic temperature or humidity fluctuations, hungry mice or eager bookworms, then you don't need to do too much to preserve it. Digital material is quite different, and digital preservation is something that the archive sector is still grappling with. In the Vilnius archive, I've experienced firsthand the speedy degradation of digital material, having spent quite a bit of time trying to wrestle the digital files from floppy disks like these ones, and quite a bit more once the files have been copied, trying to access the files in obsolete formats. This can be caused by lots of things. So hardware becoming obsolete, file formats no longer being supported, bit rot and other problems. Fortunately, we often do have printed copies of the digital files as well. For the future, I've created a digital preservation workflow to guide the John Doerr scholar from receiving the digital material to depositing the data with the ADS. We won't have a digital preservation system of our own, since that would need an archivist to maintain it. I've also created a list of recommended file formats for depositors to try to ensure that we can access the digital data that we receive. This will list file formats that are open source and not too obscure, so more likely to remain usable in the future. And I think that's pretty much everything from me. Yeah, pass over to Nicole.
Thank you, Felicity. Okay, so for kind of the rest of the talk for the next kind of 10 to 15 minutes, what I'd like to talk about a little bit is more kind of the user's perspective of the archive, and just to give like a few examples of how some recent and current research and heritage projects have actually made use of some of the material that is available in the archive. So one that Felicity already mentioned, and that will be familiar to some people here already, is a major project that David Mattingly undertook to publish the Charles Daniels excavations in the Fezzan region of Libya. So those excavations had been carried out between 1958 and 1977, and all the notes and photographs and materials that Felicity mentioned, they'd all been deposited in the archive, but it had never been published. So David and his team went through all of this material, and they published it in conjunction with carrying out these new and kind of further investigations in the region, which, as Felicity already mentioned as well, really changed our understanding of that region of Libya. The archive has also been used extensively by graduate students, including myself, and also Julia Nicolaus, who, as some of you will know, she did her PhD here in Leicester a few years ago. And both of us used the archive to do new research and analyses on a series of small and kind of lesser known rural sites across northwestern Libya. Julia, along with Nick Ray, has also gone on to work on another funded project, which was specifically geared towards using archival material to illuminate the relationships between cemeteries and mausolea. And of course, there are many other students over the last kind of 10 to 15 years who've been working on North African topics who've made use of the archive material to varying extents, including Ahmed Bouzayan, Nicola Munyai, Ahmed Emraj, some familiar names to those of you who've been around Leicester for a few years. Now, in the case of Julia's and my work in particular, this access to the archive was just so crucial, and probably neither of us would have been able to complete the topics that we did without it, because during the period that we were both doing our work, of course, the civil war in Libya had made it impossible for foreign researchers to visit, and so neither of us could do field work like we had originally planned. Now, the situation is slowly improving, and I do know some people who are starting to venture back, but it's still obviously very difficult. So the kind of availability of this huge archive of photographs and notes of not just major sites, but importantly, many of these kind of lesser known sites, some of which have not previously been published, was and is an indispensable resource for those of us doing research on Libya. In addition, and I'm going to come back to this a little bit, but even if and when we can return to Libya to do fieldwork, many sites recorded in the archive have been damaged or destroyed since they were first recorded, as Felicity mentioned earlier as well. And the data held in the archive is the only remaining trace of many of those sites. Another recent project which has made use of photographs in the archive was the Libyan Antiquities at Risk project. And this was a joint venture between the then Society for Libyan Studies, now BILNAS, and the University of Leicester, and was supported by the Society and the AHRC. So as many of you may know, following the revolution in Libya in 2011, there was a really big increase in looting, particularly sculpture from Libya's kind of Hellenistic and Roman period cemeteries. In 2013, for example, this statue that you see in the upper right of Persephone, which is dated to the 2nd century BC, was seized by border officials in London. It made headlines at the time and was determined to have come from the World Heritage Site of Cyrene in Libya, and it was destined to be sold on the black market here in the UK. It was eventually returned to Libya in 2021. Now, a big problem, obviously, with looted antiquities like this is that at the point when they're seized, their provenience is obviously unknown in most cases, and it can sometimes be really difficult to determine where they've come from. So the aim of this Libyan Antiquities at Risk project was to develop an illustrated reference website and database of the types of objects in Libya which might be at risk of looting. So the idea was that when stolen objects are recovered, it can basically help customs officials, international agencies, museum curators, the police, and the cultural heritage sector in general to more quickly and easily identify if those objects had potentially originated in Libya. And you can do this sort of based on stylistic similarities or distinctive features, and basically to help prevent the sale of Libyan antiquities on the illegal art market. And so the photographs and that information that was used to develop this reference website did actually largely come from the BILNAS archive, because again, it contains not only photos of kind of well-known published objects and sites, but many unpublished objects from lesser known sites, which would be kind of less well known to authorities or even experts if they didn't happen to be experts already in Libyan archaeology in particular. In addition, it also provides kind of a record and database of objects which may already be on the black market so that authorities can look out for them. This photo was taken in 1969 at the site of a collapsed Roman mausoleum. And from what I understand, basically no one knows where this relief is anymore. It's not been seen since the 1970s. The site is gone. And it's basically presumed to have been looted, and it's perhaps been sold on the black market. So if it ever does turn up again, having this image available in the archive and then in a database like the one created by the Libyan Antiquities at Risk project, it's obviously going to make it easier for it to be properly identified and then returned to where it belongs. So the material in the archive is also really immensely valuable for projects like the one that I currently work for, which is the EAMENA project, to kind of track and record the condition of sites over time. So, for example, this is a collection that Felicity already mentioned, the David Smith papers, which holds several hundred photos of the Hellenistic and Roman period site of Takra in Libya, dating from an expedition in the 1960s. And so what I've been able to do is to use the photographs in the archive and compare them to more recent photographs of the site to kind of track how the site has changed over time. And as Felicity also mentioned, this is, this is the type of activity that we sometimes have interns do to do small projects like this. So you can see in this example, just to start, you can see on the left this kind of arched doorway, and then on the right, kind of more recently, about 50 years later, you can see that it is collapsed. Similarly, here we have two views of the west gate of the city, and it's kind of like sort of spot the difference game. But you can see here where the red circles are that some blocks have been removed or they've fallen off of the gate. In this example, you can actually see that a whole series of blocks have been removed or fallen off of this wall. This block in particular, we can have a look at and we can see that it is no longer there. Luckily, in this case, we find that it hasn't been looted, but we can find it in another photo and it has simply fallen off the back. But I can't be sure about the other blocks that are missing. In this case, this is just an example of, this is some Greek graffiti on the city wall. And you can see how much more of this wall has been exposed in the kind of intervening years. Here I've just underlined one of the names to give you kind of a reference point of how much more is now visible of this wall. And then finally, here in this example, we have a series of rock-cut tombs. And you can just see on the upper right of the more recent photo, how the construction of the building here, how close it is to the edge of the tombs, and in fact is probably on top of them because these underground tombs have been carved right into the rock. They go quite far back. And then if we have a look just on the satellite imagery, you can actually, so this is the building here, this is the edge of the quarry with the tombs, and this is the building. So the EAMENA project is using data like this to do updated monitoring about the condition and damage to sites that have occurred over the last 100 years. And it really gives us a good sense of how sites have changed and been damaged in this time. And all of this data goes into our online database. Now, some of the changes that I've shown here, I mean, they're not necessarily huge, a couple of blocks that have kind of fallen off a wall here or there, but cumulatively, this does indicate a degree of deterioration of the site. So knowing exactly where and when this has occurred at different parts of the site is really important and useful information for heritage and conservation activities. Now, and then finally, in addition to using kind of more recent photographs from the field, particularly again, since it's very difficult currently to visit Libya, as you may know, the EAMENA project relies heavily on satellite imagery, and we can again use data from the archive to help us relocate previously recorded sites, and evaluate and compare their current condition to when they were first recorded. So for example, the sites in this landscape that you see here on the satellite imagery, these were recorded in 1979 by the UNESCO Libyan Valleys Project. And you can hopefully see on the image that I've noted it's kind of several farm buildings. There's a cemetery and a fortified farm building. Collectively, this landscape kind of, the buildings date to kind of the 1st to 4th centuries AD. So if we start with these two buildings, for example, we can see here that these ones were very easily identifiable. Their plans were published in the kind of official survey volumes, and we can see that they appear to be in good shape, and they match the published sketch plans very closely. But if we look at this site over here, for example, the plan for this site was not published. The survey recorded over 2,000 sites, so it's not surprising they didn't have room to publish every single site plan in the book. But because the survey happened in 1979, of course, naturally, they didn't have handheld GPS. So it was really difficult to confirm that this site was, in fact, the same one described in the Gazetteer. But as you can see here in the archive, we do luckily find the original sketch plan, which actually does match very well, and we can confirm that this is the same site being referenced in the publication. You can also see in this case, however, as well, though, that we do have some evidence of bulldozing here very close to the ancient building. So this is something we definitely want to record and be concerned about. We have a similar amount of information for GH 126, which you can see, here. And it also has a very brief gazetteer entry and a sketch plan of the site in the archive, which was not published. But in this case, you can obviously see that I've put a note on the imagery that I believe that this site has been destroyed. Now, according to the archived field notes, GH 126 should be pretty immediately to the west of GH 125, but I wasn't able to find anything that looks remotely like the sketch plan of the site on the satellite imagery. What we do know, however, is that also using satellite imagery, I was able to determine that this road was constructed in 1991, about 12 years after the site was first recorded. And so this leads me very strongly to believe that GH 126 must have been directly in the path of the road. And unfortunately, it was destroyed. I mean, this is a real shame in this case. This was actually potentially one of the earliest rural sites in the region, with evidence of Roman pottery from as early as the 1st century AD, which for this particular area, you'll just have to trust me, is very early indeed. So what this means is that what you see on the right in this brief entry of the Gazetteer and this original physical site sheet and sketch plan in the archive is basically now the only existing record of this site. So those are just a few of the ways that the AMINA project and some other projects have been using the material in the archive for research and heritage projects. And thank you very much for your attention.
That's great. I was will you come up for questions? I was particularly intrigued to think about just how important this research becomes, keeping an avenue, a dialogue open with scholars in Libya as what you said, diplomatic relations are officially strained. We're going to take question and answer now.
Thank you. This is a question for you, Felicity. Really, it's just sort of curiosity. I thought that was really interesting. I just wonder if you could sort of tell us, what do you think is the most intriguing or interesting or unusual item you've found in the...
It keeps changing. I think maybe some of the photographs that I used in the engagement sessions, just because they were interesting. There was one particular picture. I think pictures where people have their own personal stories that are sort of sparked by that photograph, and it sort of like gathers meaning as each different person looks at it. So woolly answer.
I think we're at time for one more question.
We have one online. From Debbie Pearson. This was a brilliant talk. When there is no archivist imposed and volunteer students will be continuing with cataloging, how will this be monitored for standards?
That's a very good question. So I think it's always, it's never going to be quite as good. I think the next archivist who comes along will then standardise it afterwards. Who asked that out of interest? Because that's a good question.
Maybe.
Okay.
All right, well, let's thank them one more time.